There is a mountain in Northern California that has been drawing people in for centuries. Not climbers, not tourists, not scientists. People who feel something pulling them there. Something they can't name. Something that starts as a dream and ends as a conviction. They arrive from every direction, speaking every language, carrying every kind of background, and they all end up standing at the base of the same volcanic peak, staring upward, saying the same thing in different words. Something is down there. Something old. Something that was here long before we were. And the longer you spend with the evidence, the harder it becomes to walk away and pretend you never heard any of this. If you're watching this to fall asleep, that's exactly why I make these videos. Maybe subscribe and let me know where are you right now and what time is it. Mount Shasta rises 14,179 feet above the floor of Northern California. It stands alone. That matters. Most mountains are part of ranges, connected to neighbors, sharing ridgelines and valley systems. Shasta stands apart from the Cascade chain in a way that makes it look almost deliberate, almost placed. Native peoples across the region noticed this too. They didn't call it coincidence. They called it presence, and they organized entire cosmologies around what that presence meant. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before we talk about what might be beneath the mountain, we need to talk about what the mountain actually is, because the physical geology of Shasta is not separate from the mystery. It's central to it. Shasta is a stratovolcano. It's built from alternating layers of hardened lava, ash deposits, and pyroclastic material accumulated over roughly 600,000 years of eruptions. The most recent significant eruptive activity happened around 300 years ago, with smaller events possibly as recent as the early 20th century. This is not a dead mountain. It breathes. Its flanks are laced with fumaroles, vents that exhale sulfurous gases from somewhere deep below the surface. Hot springs bubble up around its base. The snowpack above and the geothermal heat below create an environment where the boundary between solid rock and open space is constantly being renegotiated. And here is the first geological fact that serious researchers always pause at: lava tubes. When basaltic lava flows rapidly across the surface and then cools unevenly, the outer shell hardens while molten material continues flowing beneath. When the interior eventually drains out, what remains is a tunnel, a hollow tube of rock. These formations exist all over the world. Some of the most famous are in Iceland, Hawaii, and the Canary Islands. They can stretch for miles. They can be tall enough to walk through upright. They can branch and connect and stack on top of each other in complex systems that take years to fully map. California has lava tubes. The region around Mount Shasta has the geological profile to produce extensive ones, and yet the volcanic tunnel systems beneath and around Shasta have never been fully mapped. The terrain above is difficult. Many areas are protected. Some zones require permits to access. Others are simply too dangerous for systematic exploration. What we know about the subsurface structure of the mountain comes mostly from remote sensing, seismic analysis, and the accounts of people who went looking on their own. Those accounts are where the story starts to get interesting. The first written references to something unusual beneath Mount Shasta appear in the late 19th century. This is important context. The 1880s and 1890s were a period of intense popular interest in lost civilizations. Heinrich Schliemann had just excavated Troy. The ruins of Mesoamerican cities were being reported in newspapers. Theosophy, a spiritual movement built around the idea of ancient wisdom preserved in hidden lineages, was spreading rapidly through educated classes in Europe and America. The intellectual climate was primed for discoveries of exactly this kind. But the Mount Shasta accounts don't read like fabrications. They read like confused, earnest attempts to describe something the witnesses genuinely didn't understand. The first major account comes from 1884, published in the Eureka Journal, a small paper serving the region just north of the mountain. A miner named Frederick Spencer Oliver was living near the base of Shasta while working claims in the area. He reported a series of encounters with individuals he described as unusually tall, robed in white or pale material, and uninterested in engaging with outsiders. They appeared near the lower slopes at dawn and dusk, and they vanished back into the terrain without any trace of where they'd gone. Oliver didn't claim they were supernatural. He was a mining man, practical and blunt. He said they were people living somewhere in the mountain. Oliver went on to write a book that he claimed was channeled to him from a spirit connected to the mountain, a work called A Dweller on Two Planets. The framing is easy to dismiss. and most historians do dismiss it on those grounds. But embedded in the book are detailed descriptions of underground architecture, ventilation systems, and a culture that maintained itself in isolation from the surface world. The descriptions predate the major wave of Mount Shasta mythology by decades. Oliver didn't have a cultural template to draw on for what he was describing. That doesn't prove anything, but it's worth noting. Around the same period, prospectors working the creeks and draws on the western side of the mountain were reporting something different. Sounds. Vibrations felt through the soles of boots pressed against rock. A low-frequency hum that came and went without obvious cause. Several men independently described the same phenomenon at different times and in different locations around the base of the mountain. The vibrations were strongest near certain rock formations, and they ceased entirely when the observer moved away from those spots. Geologists studying the region at the time attributed the sounds to geothermal activity, hot fluids moving through underground passages, gases escaping through narrow fractures. This is a perfectly reasonable explanation, and it's probably correct for at least some of what was being reported. But the consistency of the accounts, the specificity of the locations, and the fact that some of the sounds had rhythmic qualities that witnesses described as almost mechanical kept pulling at the edges of the official explanation. By the early 20th century, the stories had accumulated enough mass to attract the attention of writers and investigators who weren't just passing through. One of the most significant of these was Edward Lanza, a journalist who published a long feature in the Los Angeles Times Sunday magazine in 1932. The piece was titled something along the lines of California's Mystic Mountain, and it drew directly from interviews Lanza conducted with people in the Mount Shasta region. The picture that emerged from those interviews was remarkably consistent. Local residents, including farmers, loggers, and small business owners with no stake in the mystical reputation of the mountain, described seeing lights moving across the slopes at night. Not campfires, not lanterns carried by hikers. Lights that moved in patterns too deliberate for natural phenomena and that appeared at elevations where no trails existed. They described meeting individuals in the forests near the mountain's base who spoke with unusual accents, who wore clothing that didn't match any regional style, who purchased goods in local stores with what appeared to be gold nuggets rather than minted currency, and who declined to say where they came from. When local people tried to follow these individuals back into the forest, they lost track of them in terrain that offered no logical hiding places. No camps were found, no footprints led anywhere conclusive. The individuals simply ceased to be traceable. Lanza's article didn't make claims, it reported what people said. And what people said was that there was a community of some kind associated with the mountain, that this community maintained strict separation from the surrounding population, and that the mountain itself seemed to provide them with everything they needed. Now, before we go any further, it's worth sitting with what the conventional explanations actually account for. Some of the robed figures near the mountain were almost certainly members of the I Am activity, a religious movement founded by Guy Ballard in the 1930s that centered on Mount Shasta as a spiritually significant site. Members of this group did wear distinctive clothing. They did perform rituals on and around the mountain. They did behave in ways that seemed strange to outsiders. This explains a portion of the sightings, particularly those from the mid-20th century onward. Some of the lights were almost certainly natural atmospheric phenomena. The mountain creates its own weather systems due to its elevation and isolation. Lenticular clouds, which form over prominent peaks, can sometimes create optical effects that experienced observers have described as luminous. Ball lightning, though poorly understood, has been documented in volcanic regions. Geologically active areas can produce what researchers call earthquake lights, a phenomenon involving electromagnetic effects from stressed rock that results in visible glow. Some of the underground sounds were almost certainly geothermal. The mountain is not dormant. Its internal heat drives continuous movement of fluids through its structure. This creates sound, it creates vibration, it creates precisely the kind of low-frequency hum that witnesses described. All of that accounts for some of it. The problem is that it doesn't account for all of it, and the portion that remains unaccounted for is where the serious research begins. Here's what conventional explanation doesn't address. It doesn't address the testimony of trained geologists and geographers who conducted surveys of the mountain's lower slopes in the 1940s and reported finding cave openings that didn't match any known lava tube formation in their catalogues, and that led into passages too structured to be natural fractures. It doesn't address the accounts of multiple independent witnesses who described the same specific location on the northern face of the mountain, a location characterized by a particular rock formation above a wide ledge, as a place where the mountain seemed to open and close, where people went in and didn't come out, where the temperature differential between the ledge and the surrounding air was dramatic and consistent. It doesn't address the oral traditions of the peoples who lived near this mountain for thousands of years before any European presence in the region. And those traditions are where the story reaches its deepest roots. The Shasta people, the Modoc, the Achumawi, the Wintu, the Karuk, these nations are distinct. They speak different languages. They have different ceremonial structures, different histories, different relationships to the land around them. But they share something in common when it comes to Mount Shasta. They all describe it as a place where the normal rules don't apply, where the world above the surface and the world beneath it are not separated the way they are everywhere else, where ancestors go, where spirits live, where time moves differently. This alignment across independent cultural traditions is not something to wave away. These groups were not borrowing from each other. The Modoc and the Wintu had significant cultural and linguistic differences. The Karuk maintained a distinct identity and ceremonial life that developed largely separately. They didn't arrive at the same conclusion about the mountain because they were copying from a shared template. They arrived at it because they all had relationships with the same mountain over very long periods of time, and what they observed led them to the same description. The Wintu in particular preserved highly specific accounts. Their oral tradition describes a people who lived inside the mountain, not metaphorically inside, literally inside. A people who moved between the interior world and the surface world through specific passages that were known to the mountain's guardians. The Wintu themselves did not enter these passages. The mountain was not theirs to enter, but they knew the passages existed because they had seen the people who used them. The description of these interior people is consistent across generations of Wintu testimony. They were tall, they were light-skinned or appeared to have a kind of luminosity to their skin. They wore garments that weren't made from animal hide or plant fiber in the way the Wintu made garments. They possessed knowledge of healing that went far beyond what any surface-dwelling people had developed, and they were not hostile. When they appeared near Wintu settlements, which happened rarely and never without apparent purpose, they came with something to offer: knowledge, warnings, occasionally objects that had no counterpart in the surface world. The Modoc accounts are somewhat different in character, but consistent in conclusion. Their tradition describes the mountain as a place where the Creator first descended to the earth. The interior of the mountain is the Creator's dwelling. Access to the interior is not forbidden so much as simply not available to human beings who aren't called there. The Modoc didn't frame the underground inhabitants as a separate species. They framed them as an older lineage, a people who had been in this place long before the surface world was inhabited by anyone. The Achumawi, who lived to the east and south of the mountain, maintained traditions about underground passages connecting Shasta to other significant locations in the region. Their accounts described a network rather than a single tunnel, a system of connected underground pathways through which certain individuals could travel great distances beneath the surface of the earth. The Achumawi didn't claim these passages as their own. They described them the way you describe a road that exists on someone else's land. It's there. You know it's there. It doesn't belong to you. Takoda sat with his grandfather near the base of a mountain, so old it had watched 10,000 generations come and go. He was 7 years old. His grandfather was the last man in their family who still carried the full oral tradition, the full, unbroken lineage of words that had been passed from speaker to speaker since before anyone could remember when the passing had begun. The fire between them was small. The night was cold. Above them, the mountain's white peak caught what moonlight remained after the clouds had taken most of it. The grandfather spoke slowly. He wasn't performing. He was remembering. There's a difference. When you perform, you look at the audience. When you remember, you look somewhere else entirely. He looked at the mountain. He said that when his own grandfather was young, a man came to the village from the lower passages. Not from the forest, from below, from the place where the stone opens. This man wasn't afraid. He wasn't asking for help. He was delivering something, a piece of knowledge about a coming dry season, specific enough that the village was able to prepare, to move the planting area, to store water in a way they hadn't done before. The dry season came exactly as described, and the village survived it better than the villages to the north and south, who hadn't received the warning. Takoda asked his grandfather what the man from below looked like. The grandfather was quiet for a long time. Then he said, he looked like someone who had never worried about the sun. That's the story as it was passed to me, the grandfather said. I tell it to you now as part of the chain. You will tell it to someone after me. The details don't matter as much as the pattern. The pattern is this. The mountain keeps something, and sometimes what it keeps reaches out. This is not a verbatim transcript of any documented testimony. It's a composite built from the structure of many accounts, a way of bringing you into the texture of what oral transmission feels like when you encounter it secondhand through ethnographic records. The point isn't any single story. The point is that this kind of accounts describing deliberate contact between surface inhabitants and underground inhabitants associated specifically with Mount Shasta, appears repeatedly across multiple unconnected cultures, across multiple centuries of documentation. That pattern is the thing. In 1904, a geologist named J.C. Brown was employed by the British mining company Sunnyside Gold to survey mineral deposits in the Northern California region. This was routine work. The company needed to know what was worth pursuing. Brown was competent and experienced. He had worked claims in Montana and British Columbia before coming to California, and he was not a man given to fanciful interpretation. According to accounts that emerged decades later, Brown's survey of the Mount Shasta region led him to discover a series of cave openings on the mountain's northern and western flanks. What he found inside these caves was not what he was looking for. He found tunnels, not natural passages. Tunnels with walls that showed evidence of systematic shaping. Tunnels that maintained a consistent diameter over their accessible length. Tunnels whose floors were smooth in a way that suggested either deliberate leveling or the passage of many feet over an extremely long period of time. He also found artifacts, objects of carved stone and what appeared to be worked metal, statuary of a scale and craft that had no counterpart in anything attributed to the known pre-Columbian peoples of the California region. He documented what he found as thoroughly as his field equipment allowed. He took notes, he made sketches, he collected small samples. Then he sealed the entrance to the passage he had been exploring, marked its location on a private map, and said nothing to his employers or to anyone else for more than 30 years. In 1934, Brown reappeared. He was old by then, in his 80s, and he had apparently decided he was running out of time to do something with what he knew. He contacted researchers connected to a group studying pre-Columbian North American cultures and offered to lead an expedition to the site. He brought together 80 individuals, a mix of interested academics, journalists, and members of the public, and announced that he was going to take them to the tunnels and show them what he had found 3 decades earlier. The expedition never happened. John C. Brown died shortly before the scheduled departure. His maps were never found. His notes, if they survived at all, have never been located in any archive. The 80 people who were prepared to go with him dispersed. Some gave interviews describing what Brown had told them. Others said nothing more about it. The story of the 1934 expedition exists almost entirely in second-hand form. This is the part of the Mount Shasta story that serious researchers find most frustrating, not because Brown's account is inherently more credible than others, but because the structure of what happened, the decades of silence followed by the deathbed disclosure, followed by the death before the disclosure could be verified, follows a pattern that appears over and over in the Shasta record. Accounts that are substantive enough to take seriously, interrupted at precisely the moment when verification becomes possible. Whether that pattern reflects something about the nature of what's being discovered, something about the kind of people who discover it, or simply the operation of ordinary bad luck applied to a subject that was already difficult to verify, is a question that doesn't have a clean answer. The 1930s brought a different kind of attention to the mountain. The Rosicrucian Order, a philosophical and esoteric organization with roots going back to 17th century Europe, published claims that Mount Shasta was one of several points on the Earth's surface where underground civilizations maintained contact with the surface world. The Rosicrucians were explicit about the nature of these civilizations. They described them as remnants of Lemuria, the hypothetical lost continent that some theosophical writers had proposed as an ancient predecessor to Atlantis. The Lemurian hypothesis has a complicated history. In the 19th century, before the mechanism of plate tectonics was understood, some scientists actually proposed a lost landmass in the Indian Ocean to explain the distribution of lemur species across widely separated regions. The name Lemuria was geological in origin. It was proposed seriously. When plate tectonics later explained the distribution through continental drift, the geological Lemuria was abandoned. But by then, theosophical writers had borrowed the name and attached an entire civilization to it. Helena Blavatsky, the founder of Theosophy, described Lemurians as a root race, an ancient form of human consciousness that preceded modern humanity. In her framework, different root races dominated the Earth in sequence, and each previous race didn't fully disappear but retreated, surviving in hidden or diminished form, while the newer race dominated the surface. The Lemurians, in this framework, had gone underground. They had retreated from the surface world as it became increasingly inhabited by the newer races and had maintained their civilization in the spaces beneath the Earth. This is mythology. There is no geological or archaeological evidence for a Pacific Ocean continent that sank. The Lemurian narrative is a spiritual and philosophical framework, not a historical claim. But here's the complication. The Lemurian narrative, which arrived at Mount Shasta via Theosophy and the Rosicrucians in the early 20th century, attached itself to a place that already had a pre-existing local tradition of underground inhabitants. The new mythology didn't create the stories. It absorbed stories that were already there and reinterpreted them through a different framework. The question that researchers who approach this topic seriously have to grapple with is whether the Lemurian overlay clarified something true or distorted something true, whether the elaborate cosmological framework of Theosophy helped identify a real phenomenon, or whether it captured the phenomenon in language so loaded with cultural baggage that the real signal, whatever it might have been, became nearly impossible to extract. This is not a trivial problem. It affects how every piece of evidence gets interpreted. When a Wintu elder describes the people who come from inside the mountain, is that description being reported accurately, or has it been filtered through the Lemurian framework by the time it reaches written record? When a prospector describes underground sounds, is his account being taken seriously, or is it being absorbed into a narrative that makes it impossible to evaluate on its own terms? The overlay problem is real, and it's one of the reasons the Mount Shasta evidence base is so difficult to work with. You have to be constantly asking not just what was observed, but what framework was being used to translate the observation into words, and whether that framework added something or took something away. By the mid-20th century, the mountain had developed a reputation that drew a specific kind of visitor. People who were already convinced of the Lemurian narrative arrived looking for confirmation. They found what they were looking for, because they knew what to look for and were willing to accept ambiguous evidence as confirmation. This is a problem. Motivated perception is not good evidence, but in the same period, a different category of visitor was also coming to the mountain, and their experiences are harder to dismiss. Military personnel stationed at training installations in Northern California described unexplained phenomena near the mountain as early as the 1940s. The accounts are fragmentary and come mostly from second-hand sources, men describing what they heard from colleagues, family members, or fellow veterans. But several describe the same thing: underground facilities, either existing ones that military personnel encountered unexpectedly, or ones that were being constructed. The period from the late 1940s through the 1960s saw extensive classified construction activity throughout the American West. The government built deep underground facilities for communications, for nuclear weapons storage, for government continuity purposes. Some of these facilities are now public knowledge. NORAD's facility beneath Cheyenne Mountain in Colorado is probably the most famous. Others remain classified or have been only partially disclosed. Northern California is not a region that features prominently in the official narrative of Cold War underground construction, but the area around Mount Shasta has characteristics that would have made it attractive for certain purposes. Remote location, difficult access, existing geological complexity that would make external observation of construction activity difficult to interpret, geothermal resources that could theoretically support self-sufficient operations. There's no documented evidence of classified government construction beneath or within Mount Shasta. There are Freedom of Information Act requests that have returned documents with portions redacted. There are accounts from people who worked in intelligence-adjacent fields describing the mountain as a location that required a special category of access clearance to approach closely. There are locals who describe sudden changes in the access regime around specific areas of the mountain during the mid-20th century, areas that had previously been open to prospectors and hikers that became, without clear explanation, off-limits. None of this proves anything, but it adds a layer to the story that's entirely separate from the Lemurian framework, and that points toward a different kind of hidden activity, one that is entirely human in origin and purpose. The question of whether classified human activity in the mountain and the pre-existing traditions about non-human or pre-modern activity in the mountain are completely separate phenomena or whether they are related in some way, is one that the available evidence simply doesn't answer. The geology of Mount Shasta has attracted serious academic attention over the decades, but the focus has always been on the surface, on eruption history, on glacial systems, on the chemistry of the mountain's hot springs. The subsurface structure, beyond what can be inferred from seismic data and drilling records at the mountain's periphery, remains genuinely poorly understood. What seismic data does reveal is significant. The mountain sits over a subduction zone where the Juan de Fuca plate is being driven beneath the North American plate. This process generates heat and drives magmatic activity. It also generates the kind of long-period tremors that geologists associate with the movement of fluids through underground passages. The tremors beneath Shasta are not continuous, but they recur at intervals that don't match the pattern of purely geothermal fluid movement. Something about the underground structure of the mountain creates a tremor signature that is unusual compared to other Cascade volcanoes of similar size and geological age. Volcanic petrologists who have studied the mountain's eruptive history note that the lava sequences in Shasta's geological record show something unusual. There are gaps. Not just time gaps between eruptions, which are normal, but compositional gaps, periods during which the material being erupted changes character in ways that suggest the source conditions deep within the mountain shifted significantly. These shifts could mean that the internal structure of the mountain, the network of passages and chambers through which magma moves, has changed over time in ways that created new open spaces and closed old ones. In practical terms, this means the underground geometry of the mountain is complex, dynamic, and incompletely understood. Any statement about what definitely is not beneath Shasta is a statement made without the data to support it. We simply don't have the imaging technology deployed in this region at the resolution required to characterize the subsurface fully. This matters because absence of evidence is often treated as evidence of absence, and in this case it's not. We haven't looked thoroughly enough to say there's nothing to find. In the summer of 1987, a woman named Carol Radin, who later published an account of her experience, was hiking on the western slope of Mount Shasta above the tree line when she encountered a man sitting on a rock outcropping who seemed to have appeared without any approach she had observed. She was alone. The trail she was following was not a frequently used one. There was no logical direction from which the man could have come that she hadn't been watching. The man was tall, taller than average. He wore clothing she described as simple, pale, and of an unclear material. He was looking at the mountain above them, not at her. He didn't startle when she came close. He turned and looked at her as if he had known she was approaching but had been waiting for the appropriate moment to acknowledge her. He spoke to her for approximately 20 minutes. She described the conversation as covering a range of topics, including the mountain's geological history, the existence of underground passage systems she had not known about, and a general characterization of the community that used those passages. He said they were not supernatural. He said they were not extraterrestrial. He said they were people who had chosen to live differently, who had developed their civilization in a direction that prioritized different things than surface civilization had prioritized, and who maintained their separation from the surface world deliberately and with considerable effort. Before she could ask any of the many questions she later wished she had asked, he stood up, nodded in a way she described as formal and deliberate, and walked around the rock outcropping. She followed immediately. He was not there. There was nowhere he could have gone in the time it took her to follow him. The rock dropped steeply on the far side. There were no other trail features. He was simply gone. Radin is a credible witness in the sense that she was not a person with a prior investment in Shasta mythology. She wasn't there looking for Lemurians. She was there for the hiking. Her account doesn't fit neatly into the theosophical framework because she specifically described the man as ordinary and human, not as a member of a spiritually advanced ancient race. His explanation of his community was practical, almost administrative. They chose to live underground. They worked to maintain their separation. It wasn't mystical. It was a choice, maintained over a very long time. Whether she encountered what she described, and whether she described it accurately, are questions that can't be resolved from this distance. But the structure of her account, the unexpected encounter, the specific and unembellished information conveyed, the impossible disappearance, is consistent with dozens of other accounts spanning more than a century. Let's go back further, much further. Before the Spanish mission system reached Northern California, before European contact of any kind had reorganized the indigenous cultures of the region. Before the fur trade had pushed British and American trappers into the mountains of the Pacific Slope. Before any of that, the peoples of Northern California maintained their relationships with the land around them in forms that had been developing for thousands of years. Archaeological investigation of the Mount Shasta region has been limited. This is partly a function of access and funding, and partly a function of the sensitivity of the area as a sacred site for multiple native nations, which limits the kind of invasive archaeology that would be most informative. What has been investigated produces evidence of human occupation in the region going back at least 8,000 to 10,000 years, with some evidence suggesting even earlier presence. What the archaeological record shows is a pattern of occupation that has always maintained Mount Shasta itself as a distinct category. The mountain is ringed by habitation sites at various distances, but direct habitation on the mountain slopes is consistently absent or minimal in the archaeological record. For most mountains in a region, this would be explained by the elevation and the harsh conditions, but Shasta's flanks include substantial areas at lower elevations where habitation would have been quite feasible. The absence of permanent settlement on or near the mountain appears to be deliberate rather than practical. This is consistent with what the oral traditions say. The mountain was not a place for ordinary habitation, it was a place for specific, purposeful engagement, approached with ceremony and intention. People went to the mountain when they needed to engage with what the mountain represented. They did not live there. But someone apparently did, because scattered within the archaeological record of the region are artifacts that don't fit the cultural pattern of any of the known groups. Objects made from materials not locally sourced. Worked stone of a technique that doesn't correspond to any identified regional tradition. Pieces of worked metal in contexts predating any documented metalworking culture in the area. These objects consistently cluster in locations near the mountain's lower slopes, in the areas where the oral traditions describe the underground inhabitants as sometimes emerging. The archaeological community has not made a great deal of these anomalies. Anomalies are uncomfortable. They complicate existing frameworks. The tendency in academic archaeology is to look for ways to incorporate anomalous data into existing models rather than to let anomalous data challenge those models. This is understandable as a methodological conservatism, but it means that the anomalies accumulate in footnotes and supplemental data tables rather than becoming the subject of focused investigation. There is a researcher named William Edwards who spent the better part of a decade in the late 20th century attempting to compile and cross-reference all documented accounts of unusual activity associated with Mount Shasta. He was an independent investigator, not affiliated with any academic institution, which gave him freedom to approach the material without institutional constraints, but also meant his work lacked the credentialing that would make it easy to take seriously within formal academic discourse. His compilation ran to several hundred accounts spanning the period from the 1850s through the 1990s. His analysis attempted to separate accounts that could be attributed to natural causes, to social movements like the I am activity, to misidentification and motivated perception, from accounts that resisted those explanations. What remained after that filtering process was a smaller but still substantial body of accounts sharing specific characteristics. Encounters in consistent geographic locations around the mountain's northern and western faces. Descriptions of individuals who appeared without traceable approach and vanished without traceable departure. Descriptions of sounds and vibrations in locations not associated with known geothermal vents. Descriptions of temperature anomalies, areas significantly warmer or cooler than the surrounding terrain without obvious geological explanation. And descriptions of physical structures, usually partial glimpses of worked stone or finished surfaces, visible in natural openings or through gaps in the terrain. Edwards noted that the geographic clustering of these accounts pointed to specific zones, not the mountain generally. The most frequently referenced area was a section of the northern face between roughly 9,000 and 11,000 feet elevation, in a zone that is technically accessible but practically very difficult due to the terrain. The second most frequently referenced area was a section of the western base, below the tree line, near a series of hot spring features that have been documented by geologists. He also noted that many of the accounts came from people who had no connection to the Shasta mystical tradition, who didn't know about the Lemurian narrative, and whose descriptions were therefore not filtered through that framework. These accounts were often more confused and less elaborately detailed than accounts from people embedded in the tradition, because they had no vocabulary to draw on, but they were also, in some ways, more useful, because they represented unmediated observation. His work was never published in a form that reached wide circulation. Copies of his manuscript exist in the collections of a few researchers who were in contact with him. His conclusion, stated carefully and with appropriate hedging, was that something in the Mount Shasta area was generating consistent, structured experiences in observers who had no shared cultural context, and that the most economical explanation for this consistency was that the observers were, in some form, reporting on a real phenomenon, even if the nature of that phenomenon remained unclear. In the summer of 1931, a series of reports reached the Siskiyou County Sheriff's Office from residents of the small communities around the mountain's base. The reports were not about strange lights or underground sounds. They were about missing persons. Not exactly missing, more precisely, people who had been seen going toward the mountain and who had subsequently returned, but who returned changed. The cases were documented in local newspaper coverage and in some correspondence that has since been archived. 3 individuals in particular were described in detail. The first was a farmer from the area east of the mountain who had gone out one morning to investigate damage to his upper pasture. He was gone for several days without explanation. When he returned, he was uninjured. He was not distressed, but he was unwilling to describe where he had been or what had happened. His family and neighbors noted that he seemed quieter afterward, more thoughtful, less interested in the concerns that had previously occupied him. He lived for another 20 years and never gave a full account of those missing days. The second was a young woman who had been hiking on a trail that circumnavigated the lower slopes. She returned to the trailhead a day later than expected, confused about how much time had passed. She described being in a space beneath the mountain, though she couldn't explain how she had gotten there. She described being treated with care and eventually being guided back to the surface. She could provide almost no specific details. She said it was as if she had been allowed to see enough to know something was there, but not enough to understand what it was. The third was a man who had gone prospecting on the mountain's northern face, and who came down after 3 days with gold nuggets of a type that assayers later described as unusually pure and of an unusual composition, suggesting they had been processed rather than found in raw form. He said he had traded for them. He wouldn't say with whom. These accounts were treated by the local authorities as curiosities rather than investigations. No one had been harmed. No crime had been committed. The unusual circumstances were noted and filed away. But their existence as documented records, not folklore, not second-hand legend, but actual documented reports to law enforcement, gives them a different character than most Mount Shasta accounts. The hot springs around the base of Mount Shasta are not in themselves remarkable. Volcanic regions commonly produce hot springs. What is somewhat unusual about some of the Shasta springs is the chemistry of the water. Certain springs on the mountain's lower western slopes produce water with mineral compositions that don't match what would be expected from simple geothermal circulation through the local rock types. The water shows evidence of having passed through environments that don't correspond to the surface geology. This doesn't have to mean anything exotic. Underground water systems are complex. Water can travel through geological formations from considerable distances and acquire unusual mineral signatures from that travel. But it does mean that at least some of the water emerging from these springs has been somewhere that isn't immediately apparent from looking at the surface geology. Water that's been somewhere underground that doesn't show up in the surface record. That's worth keeping in your mind as we continue. There's also a set of observations related to magnetic anomalies. Magnetometers operated in the vicinity of the mountain produce readings that don't match what the surface geology predicts. Certain locations show localized magnetic anomalies, areas where the magnetic field strength and orientation diverges from the surrounding baseline. Some of these anomalies could be explained by the uneven distribution of magnetite-bearing volcanic rocks beneath the surface. Others are in locations where the surface geology doesn't obviously account for them. Magnetic anomalies are one of the tools used in underground mapping. Dense rock masses, void spaces, metallic ore bodies, and certain archaeological features all produce different magnetic signatures. When military and government agencies conduct preliminary surveys for underground construction, they routinely use magnetometry as one of their tools. The presence of unexplained magnetic anomalies in a region doesn't tell you what's causing them, but it tells you that something is there that isn't obvious from the surface. The Mount Shasta magnetic anomaly data has never been the subject of a published systematic investigation. Some of it comes from geological survey work done for other purposes. Some comes from amateur investigators with consumer-grade equipment. The data is fragmentary and inconsistently collected. But what exists points toward a subsurface picture that is more complex than the official geological surveys have characterized. Now, we need to talk about the people who tried to go in, because this is the part of the story that is easiest to document and hardest to interpret. Throughout the 20th century, a number of individuals made serious, organized attempts to enter the tunnel systems that witnesses had described. Some of these attempts were motivated by scientific curiosity, some by spiritual seeking, some by simple adventurism. Their accounts share several features that are worth noting. In almost every case, the investigators report finding genuine cave openings in the areas where accounts had concentrated. Not every cave opening. Not imaginary openings projected onto a blank rock face. Actual physical openings leading into actual passages. In almost every case, the investigators report that the passages they entered ended, sometimes after a short distance, sometimes after longer explorations. They ended either in solid rock, in drops that couldn't be safely descended, or in areas where the passage became too narrow to continue. None of the organized expeditions produced evidence of the extensive tunnel systems that accounts described, but several of them produced something else. Accounts of abrupt experiences at the point where the passages ended, feelings of being turned back that went beyond the physical limitation of the passage, sudden onset of disorientation, nausea, or headache that disappeared completely when the investigator retreated. In a few cases, perceptions of sound or light that came from beyond the point where the physical passage ended. One investigator, a spelunker with considerable experience in California cave systems, published a detailed account of an exploration on the western face in the early 1970s. He had found a substantial opening, large enough to stand upright in, that led into a passage extending approximately 60 feet before turning sharply. Around the turn, the passage continued for another 40 feet and then appeared to drop. He was descending toward the drop point when he experienced something he described as a wall of force, not a physical wall, but a sensation that prevented forward movement in a way that he couldn't explain in mechanical terms. He described it as trying to walk into a wind that had no movement and no temperature, that simply stopped him. He backed up. The sensation ceased. He tried again. The sensation returned. He eventually retreated and did not return to that particular site. He was explicit in his account that he was not a mystically inclined person. He had explored hundreds of caves. He had never experienced anything comparable. He did not have an explanation. He filed it under phenomena requiring further investigation and moved on. Other accounts describe similar experiences. The specific sensation varies. Some describe it as a feeling of extreme cold. Some as a kind of cognitive static, an inability to think clearly that resolves immediately on retreat. Some as a simple but overwhelming sense of being told no, an impression so strong and immediate that it functions like a physical barrier. Taken individually, any of these accounts could be explained through psychological factors. Caves do strange things to people. The combination of darkness, enclosed space, unusual acoustics, and the knowledge that you are somewhere few people have been produces experiences that don't have straightforward explanations. Hypoxia, carbon dioxide concentrations that affect cognition before they produce physical symptoms, infrasound from geothermal sources, electromagnetic fields from geological stress, all of these can produce unusual perceptual experiences in underground environments. But the geographic consistency is striking. The accounts of being turned back cluster in the same locations as the accounts of underground inhabitants. The places where investigators report invisible barriers are the same places where witnesses report seeing people emerge from the mountain. That consistency is not what you'd expect if the experiences were purely psychological, generated by the cave environment generally. It suggests that something specific to those locations is producing those experiences. Let's go underground. Not literally, imaginatively. Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine you have descended into the mountain, not the first few hundred feet that spelunkers and casual investigators have reached. Much deeper, deep enough that the rock above you is measured in thousands of feet. Deep enough that the sound from the surface has become a memory rather than a reality. The temperature at this depth, if the rock around you is volcanic and geothermally active, is not cold. It's warm, not uncomfortably warm. The kind of warm that bones appreciate after a long exposure to the cold of high altitude. The air is moving, slowly, but moving. That means the space you're in is connected to something, that air is circulating from somewhere to somewhere. A completely closed space doesn't have moving air. The light. What is the light source? Not your headlamp. Imagine you don't have one. Poo. The accounts from people who describe being inside the mountain consistently reference light without identifying an obvious source. Bioluminescence exists in many cave environments, produced by certain fungi, certain bacteria, certain types of algae that have adapted to underground life. Extended volcanic cave systems often have their own ecosystems, precisely because they offer consistent temperature, moisture, and, in geothermally active areas, a chemical energy source that doesn't depend on sunlight. Could a civilization, and I use that word carefully, not to mean anything elaborate or advanced by modern standards, but simply a structured human community, could such a community sustain itself in a geothermally active volcanic cave system? The answer from basic principles of survivability is that it's at least theoretically possible. Geothermal energy can drive chemical reactions that produce organic matter. Underground aquifers can provide fresh water. The absence of solar radiation is a significant limitation on food production, but not an absolute barrier. Fungi and chemosynthetic organisms can form the base of a food chain that doesn't require sunlight. Controlled fire provides additional warmth and light. The challenges are enormous, but not categorically unsurmountable. More than that, there are actual documented examples of extended human habitation in underground environments. Cappadocia in modern Turkey contains underground cities that were inhabited continuously for centuries, with tens of thousands of residents living largely beneath the surface, with complex air circulation systems, fresh water sources, and food storage. These cities are not theoretical. They've been excavated and documented. People lived there. Generations of people. They maintained complex social structures and cultural traditions entirely below the surface of the earth. The Cappadocian example is not identical to what's being proposed for Mount Shasta, but it demonstrates that the proposition isn't physically absurd. Humans can and have inhabited underground environments at scale for extended periods. The question for Shasta isn't whether such habitation is possible in principle. The question is whether there's evidence of it in this specific place. There is a body of material associated with a theosophical writer named Wisha Serve, who published a book in 1931 titled Lemuria, the Lost Continent of the Pacific. The book is part mythology, part spiritual speculation, and part something that's harder to categorize. Buried within the elaborate theosophical framework are specific descriptions of the Mount Shasta community that have an oddly practical character. Serve described the underground community as numbering in the hundreds rather than thousands. He described their primary activities as agriculture, scholarship, and what he called the refinement of consciousness. He described their physical environment as a complex of chambers connected by tunnels, heated geothermally, lit by a combination of processed bioluminescence and phosphorescent minerals. He described their technology as sophisticated in specific ways, particularly in the manipulation of sound and in the use of what he called vibratory energy, while being entirely absent in ways associated with combustion and mechanical force. These descriptions are easy to dismiss as 19th century spiritual romanticism given new clothing, and they may be exactly that. But several researchers have noted that Serve's physical descriptions, stripped of the theosophical language, are internally consistent in a way that fabricated descriptions usually aren't. The logistics work. The ecosystem he describes is biologically plausible. The technology he attributes to the community is consistent with what a group of humans living in an underground geothermal environment for an extended period might actually develop, prioritizing things that work in that environment and not developing things that require the open surface world. He also described the community's relationship to the surface world in terms that have a geopolitical character rather than a mystical one. They monitored the surface world. They intervened occasionally when they calculated that interventions served their interests, which were primarily the maintenance of their own isolation. They were not benevolent guardians in the theosophical sense. They were a community managing a strategic situation, evaluating the surface world the way a small, hidden state evaluates its larger and more powerful neighbors. If you extract that framework from the theosophical language and evaluate it as a sociological description of how a community in that situation might actually behave, it's coherent. It explains the selective contact. It explains the occasional provision of useful information to surface people. It explains the careful maintenance of separation. It's not spiritual. It's strategic. In 1987, The same year that Carol Radin had her encounter on the western slope, a different kind of account emerged from the area. A group of geology graduate students from a California university were conducting fieldwork on the mountain's flanks as part of a seismic monitoring project. Their work was entirely ordinary in its intent. They were placing instruments and collecting baseline data for earthquake prediction research. On the second day of their fieldwork, while positioning instruments on the northern face at approximately 10,000 feet elevation, one member of the group discovered a surface opening in a rock formation that hadn't been noted in any of the geological surveys they were working from. The opening was approximately 4 feet in diameter, roughly circular, and led into a passage that descended at a moderate angle. They were scientists. They investigated. 2 members of the group entered the passage and followed it for approximately 90 feet before it widened significantly into what they described as a chamber of considerable size, large enough that their headlamps couldn't illuminate the far walls. The floor of the chamber was flat. Not naturally flat, the way cave floors sometimes flatten through the deposition of sediment, but smooth in a way that suggested worked stone or extremely long-term use that had worn any natural irregularities away. On the walls of the chamber were markings, not random scratchings, organized patterns, lines that formed geometric shapes, not pictographs or representational art. Geometric figures, repeated with precision that they described as inconsistent with freehand carving. They spent approximately an hour in the chamber, sketching what they could and taking photographs. Then they retreated to the surface and reported their find to their faculty advisor by radio. The faculty advisor's response was immediate. He instructed them not to re-enter the passage and not to discuss what they had found until they returned to the university. They did as instructed. When they returned, they were told that the photographs had been taken for analysis and that the matter was being reviewed. They never received the photographs back. They were told that the markings had been determined to be natural rock formations, a conclusion that at least 2 members of the group found inconsistent with what they had seen. This account comes from 2 individuals who were part of that field team, both of whom have since pursued careers outside geology, both of whom gave their accounts independently and consistently to a journalist writing about Mount Shasta in the early 2000s. Neither of them wanted to be identified by name. Both described the experience as the most professionally uncomfortable of their lives, not because of what they found, but because of how it was handled afterward. The suppression of anomalous archaeological and geological findings is not a conspiracy theory. It's a documented phenomenon. Academic institutions and funding agencies have strong incentives to avoid findings that complicate existing frameworks. Careers are built on existing frameworks. The machinery of institutional knowledge production is structurally resistant to genuinely anomalous data. This doesn't require anyone to be villainous. It requires only that people act in their own institutional interests, which they generally do. The result, over decades and centuries, is a record in which anomalies are systematically underreported, filed away, attributed to error, or quietly reclassified. And the Mount Shasta region, with its unusual combination of geological complexity, cultural sensitivity, and persistent tradition of strange reports, is exactly the kind of place where that systematic underreporting would apply most forcefully. What about the people who live there? Not in the mountain. Around it, the communities of the Mount Shasta region are small. Weed, McLeod, the town of Mount Shasta itself. They are communities whose entire existence is shaped by proximity to the mountain. Tourism, outdoor recreation, and a persistent attraction to people seeking spiritual experience or alternative lifestyles. The mountain has always drawn unusual people. That is simply a fact about the place. The long-time residents of these communities maintain their own relationship to the mountain and to the stories about it. They are largely divided. Some find the mystical tradition irritating, a cartoonish overlay on what is simply a mountain, a resource, a landscape they have practical relationships with. Others are more ambivalent. People who haven't personally experienced anything unusual but who have neighbors and relatives who have, and who don't quite know what to do with that. A smaller subset holds what might be called pragmatic belief, not belief in Lemurians or lost continents. Belief that there is something unusual about the mountain that goes beyond what has been officially documented. These are not credulous people chasing spiritual experiences. They are farmers, loggers, construction workers, people whose relationship with the land is practical and specific. They have occasionally seen things they couldn't explain. They have occasionally heard things. They don't have a grand narrative to attach these experiences to. They just know that the mountain is not entirely what it presents itself as. One rancher whose family has worked land near the mountain's base for 4 generations described it this way. You live near that mountain long enough, you stop being surprised by surprises. Something happens that doesn't have an explanation. You note it and you keep working. Maybe it adds up to something, maybe it doesn't. But you don't pretend it didn't happen. That kind of pragmatic witnessing, quiet, local, uninterested in cosmic interpretation, is in some ways the most credible category of testimony about the mountain. These are people with no agenda. They're not writing books or seeking audience. They're just describing their experience of living near a place that occasionally does things they can't explain. There is a scholar named David Hatcher Childress who has spent considerable effort cataloguing what he calls forbidden archaeology, documented anomalies in the archaeological record that don't fit conventional frameworks. His work is controversial in academic circles. His methodology is sometimes criticized. His conclusions often outrun his evidence. But his catalogue, whatever you think of his interpretation, is genuinely extensive. And within it, the Mount Shasta section is notable for the density and diversity of the anomalous reports it draws on. Childress connects the Shasta evidence to a broader pattern of anomalous underground structures and ancient civilizations that he argues existed in pre-Columbian North America on a scale that conventional archaeology has not acknowledged. His specific claims about Shasta include the existence of a network of tunnels connecting the mountain to other significant geological sites in California and Oregon, the presence of chambers containing artifacts of non-natural manufacture, and the persistence of a small human community within the mountain's volcanic structure that has maintained continuity from a period well before European contact. He doesn't prove these things. He accumulates accounts. He notes patterns. He asks questions. And some of the questions he asks are genuinely interesting. Why, for example, do accounts of unusual underground spaces cluster not just around Mount Shasta, but around a series of significant geological features stretching from Shasta south through the Sierra Nevada and into the desert southwest? Why do native oral traditions in multiple disconnected cultural groups reference underground passage networks connecting these same sites? Why do the magnetic anomaly profiles of several of these sites share characteristics that suggest similar underground structures? These are questions that deserve investigation, not acceptance. Investigation. The summer of 1965 was a dry one in Northern California. The fire risk was high, and the Forest Service was conducting more aggressive patrols than usual in the higher elevations of the Shasta region. 2 rangers working a patrol on the northern face encountered something they reported, after considerable internal debate, to their supervisor. They had been following a track through a burn area when they came across a man. He was alone. He was sitting on a rock at an elevation of about 10,500 feet. He was not in distress. He was not equipped for a multi-day wilderness stay, which is what you'd need to be at that elevation during a period of extended patrol. He had no pack, no visible supplies, no gear beyond the clothing he wore. The rangers approached. The man acknowledged them calmly. He spoke clearly and without accent. He was willing to give his name, a name that the rangers later tried to trace without success. When asked where he'd come from and where he was headed, he gave answers that didn't make practical sense given his location and his lack of equipment. He described himself as a resident of the mountain, not a visitor, a resident. The rangers described the subsequent conversation as one of the strangest of their careers. The man spoke knowledgeably about the mountain's geological history, about the tunnel systems beneath the surface, about the community that used those tunnels. He did this calmly and without apparent concern for what the rangers would think or do with the information. He seemed to find nothing unusual about the conversation. After approximately half an hour, he told the rangers that he needed to return now, and that he hoped they would take care of themselves and each other. He walked away from them into an area of large rock outcroppings. They followed immediately, within seconds, with the intention of continuing the conversation. He was not there. The rocks offered no concealment that would explain his disappearance at the speed at which it occurred. Both rangers filed a report. The report was noted by their supervisor, who described it as a standard unusual encounter report, the kind of thing that comes in occasionally from field staff working remote areas. It was not investigated further. It's in a file that's technically accessible through public records requests, though whether it's been indexed in a way that makes it easily findable is another question. Let's talk about time. Not geological time. The kind of time that matters for an underground civilization. If you were going to exist in isolation from the surface world for an extended period, one of your fundamental challenges would be the maintenance of knowledge. Not just practical knowledge about surviving underground, but the deeper knowledge that gives a civilization its character, history, science, art. 2.0. The accumulated understanding of what you are and where you came from and what your purpose is. Underground civilizations in other parts of the world address this through elaborate systems of record keeping. The Cappadocian cities maintained written records. The underground monks of various traditions maintained libraries. Knowledge preservation in an isolated underground environment requires deliberate, sustained institutional effort. The accounts associated with Mount Shasta describe exactly this. Multiple witnesses who spoke with individuals they describe as inhabitants of the underground community report that these individuals demonstrated unusual breadth of knowledge, not just practical knowledge, historical knowledge, knowledge about the surface world that went well beyond what someone isolated from the surface world should have, knowledge about things that happened in the surface world at times and places far removed from the mountain. This suggests, if the accounts are taken at face value, an active program of monitoring the surface world, of gathering and maintaining knowledge about events and developments in the larger world, while maintaining careful separation from active participation in that world. A watching brief. The behavior of a small, isolated group that knows it is surrounded by something much larger and maintains its own integrity by knowing as much as possible about what it's surrounded by. This is strategically coherent. It's the behavior of a sophisticated actor in a disadvantaged position. Watch, know. Intervene minimally and selectively. Maintain the separation that allows continued existence. The question of what would motivate a community to maintain this kind of isolation for an extended period, possibly for centuries, is an interesting one. The Cappadocian underground cities were constructed as refuges, primarily from religious persecution and military threat. The people who built them went underground because the surface was unsafe. Over time, the underground environment became home, became culture, became the world. The motivation evolved from fear to identity. Something like that process would be the most natural explanation for a long-term underground community. A group that originally went underground for safety, possibly during a period of profound disruption in the surface world, that developed over generations a culture adapted to and identified with its underground environment, and that now maintains its separation not primarily out of fear but out of identity. We are not surface people. We are the people of the inside. That's who we are. The Cascades, the volcanic range of which Mount Shasta is a part, are not the only location in North America where persistent traditions of underground human habitation exist. The traditions are actually fairly widespread, though they're not well integrated into the standard narrative of pre-Columbian North America. The Hopi maintain oral traditions about their ancestors emerging from an underground world through a sipapu, an opening in the earth, at the beginning of the current era. This is generally treated as religious mythology, but the Hopi also describe physical locations in the American Southwest where the previous world can still be accessed. Where the boundary between the underground world and the surface world is thin, these physical locations are not vague. They are specific. Specific enough that researchers have gone looking for them and have occasionally found cave systems in the described locations that show evidence of extended human use. The Anasazi, whose civilization in the American Southwest remains one of the great archaeological puzzles of the continent, maintained extensive networks of underground kivas, ceremonial chambers, some of which connected to tunnel systems whose full extent has never been mapped. The Anasazi also disappeared. They didn't slowly decline and disperse in the way archaeological cultures usually do. They stopped occupying their surface settlements with an abruptness that has never been satisfactorily explained. The leading explanation is drought. Drought certainly played a role. But drought alone doesn't explain why a sophisticated people with established relationships with difficult environments would abandon a way of life rather than adapting it, unless they adapted it in a direction that archaeology hasn't followed. Unless some portion of them went elsewhere, and elsewhere was down rather than away, the traditions of many southwestern peoples describe the departure of certain clans in the direction of the underground. Not death. Departure. Deliberate relocation to a world that already existed beneath the surface, a world that was connected to the surface world through specific passages, a world that some people knew how to access and some people did not. These traditions are not identical to the Mount Shasta accounts, but they share structural features: an underground world, a community that inhabits it, passages connecting the underground to the surface, selective contact between the two worlds, a tradition of knowledge and culture maintained in isolation. The geographic distance between the American Southwest and Northern California is significant, but it's not so significant as to make connection impossible. Pre-Columbian North America was not the sparsely populated, culturally isolated world that early European accounts described it as. Trade networks extended from the Pacific coast to the Gulf of Mexico. Information and goods and people moved across the continent through systems that were still in the early stages of understanding. An underground network connecting significant volcanic and geologically active sites across the western half of the continent is not, on its face, impossible. It's audacious. It would require extraordinary evidence to establish. But it's not physically impossible in the way that, say, a sunken continent is. In the 1990s, a series of maps began circulating in the research community interested in Mount Shasta. The maps purported to show the underground structure of the region, tunnel systems, chambers, connection points. They were attributed to various sources. Some claimed to be reconstructed from native oral traditions. Some claimed to be based on eyewitness accounts. Some claimed to derive from documents obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests. None of these maps has been authenticated. None of them has been shown to correspond to verified underground features. They circulate as documents of uncertain provenance, and they probably tell us more about the community of people interested in Mount Shasta than they do about the mountain itself. But there's something interesting about the pattern of the underground features they depict, which is remarkably consistent across maps that claim different sources. The primary tunnel access points are shown in the same general locations across multiple versions. The chamber configurations, while varying in detail, show similar overall geometries. The connection points with other significant geological features appear in similar positions. If these maps were independent fabrications, you'd expect more variation. The consistency could indicate shared fabrication, a single source producing maps that circulated under different attributed origins. Or it could indicate that the different maps are independently derived from the same underlying accounts, which happen to be consistent because they're describing the same underlying reality. The maps can't tell us which explanation is correct, but they're one more example of the consistency that characterizes the Mount Shasta evidence base. Different sources, different periods, different cultural frameworks, pointing toward the same general picture. There is a road that winds up the side of Mount Shasta, ending at a parking area at approximately 7,000 feet elevation. From there, trails extend upward onto the mountain and outward across the flanks. The mountain draws hikers, climbers, spiritual seekers, curious tourists. On a summer weekend, the parking area fills. The people who come for the hiking mostly experience the mountain as a mountain. Extraordinarily beautiful, demanding, occasionally dangerous from the weather that builds above it without much warning. They descend satisfied and talk about the views. But there are always a few who come down with something else. A sense that the mountain is not what it presents itself as, that the rock face above the trail and the slope below it are somehow more than geological features, that the occasional sound from below, the subtle vibration felt through the soles of boots, the temperature differential in certain sections of trail where no such differential should exist, adds up to something that the geological maps don't account for. These people don't always talk about it. The cultural weight of the Mount Shasta mystical tradition makes it easy to dismiss them, and they know it. If you say you felt something strange on Mount Shasta, you'll be assumed to be a Lemurian enthusiast before you've finished the sentence. The tradition has colonized the description space. It's hard to report a straightforward anomalous observation without being absorbed into the mythology. This is one of the genuine costs of the Lemurian overlay. It has made honest, careful reporting of genuine anomalous experience nearly impossible. The stigma attaches before the account is finished. So, people who have real experiences that they don't understand and that they've tried to think about carefully and honestly end up saying nothing, or saying very little to very few people, because the alternative is to be categorized in a way that ends the conversation. The people who saw the lights on the slope in 1932, the people who heard the vibrations in 1897, the geology students in 1987, the rangers in 1965, the rancher whose family has worked land near the mountain for 4 generations. These are not Lemurian enthusiasts. They're people who observed something, noted it, and filed it somewhere in their experience without the vocabulary to describe it that wouldn't immediately be misunderstood. The mountain deserves better witnesses, and the witnesses deserve better tools for being heard. As we move toward the present, the evidence base around Mount Shasta hasn't thinned. If anything, the volume of accounts has increased, partly because the internet has given people who once would have stayed silent a way to find others who share their experience. The quality of that evidence is mixed. The internet has also made it easier to construct and circulate elaborate fabrications, and the Mount Shasta subject attracts a community of people whose relationship with evidence is not always rigorous. Separating genuine account from motivated fabrication in online spaces is genuinely difficult. The tools that help with that separation, corroboration from independent sources, documentary evidence, geographic consistency, cultural independence of the witness, are all harder to apply in an online context. What does persist, even in the noisier modern record, is the clustering. The accounts, even the modern ones, continue to cluster in the same locations on the mountain. The experiences described continue to share the same core features. The witnesses, even when they're anonymous internet users, describe experiences that are consistent with what witnesses described in local newspapers 100 years ago. This is either because the modern accounts are informed by the historical ones, because people who go looking for the Mount Shasta experience find what they're looking for, or it's because the underlying phenomenon, whatever it is still there and is still producing consistent experiences in people who encounter it. The problem is that those two explanations produce the same observable output. Consistent accounts. We can't distinguish between them without being inside the experience itself. In the early 2000s, a former employee of the United States Forest Service who had worked in the Shasta Trinity National Forest for several years gave a lengthy account to an independent journalist. He asked not to be identified. His account covered several categories of unusual experience during his time working in the area. The most significant part of his account concerned a zone on the northern face of the mountain, above where standard hiking trails extended, that he described as a restricted area not marked on any public map. During his years of work in the region, he had been briefed informally by older colleagues about this zone. The briefing was not official. It was the kind of thing passed from experienced employee to new hire as practical knowledge about the territory. Don't go there. Don't ask about it. If visitors get too close, redirect them. He described following these instructions without question for several years, assuming the restricted area was related to some combination of geological hazard and administrative access rights. It was only when he attempted to look up the formal documentation for the restriction and found that no such documentation existed in the public record that he began to reconsider what the restriction was actually about. He filed an internal query about the area's status. He received a response acknowledging the restriction but describing it as an informal protocol related to research activities. He was not given specifics. When he pressed for specifics, he was transferred to a different district. He didn't pursue the matter further at that time. When he gave his account to the journalist, he was no longer employed by the Forest Service. He was not angry or aggrieved. He described himself as curious, and as having spent considerable time since his Forest Service career attempting to understand what the restriction had been about. His conclusion was that something in that zone was being protected from casual discovery, and that the protection was organized and deliberate, even if it wasn't formally documented. He didn't know what was being protected. He had not personally seen anything in the zone that explained the restriction. He was simply a person who had been told not to go somewhere, who had not been given an adequate reason, and who had eventually decided that was worth talking about. Let me ask you something directly. If there were an underground community in the Mount Shasta region, a small group of people who had lived in isolation from the surface world for a very long period of time, what would we expect to see? We'd expect to see exactly what we see. We'd expect to see oral traditions among the peoples who live nearest the mountain describing the existence of such a community. We'd expect to see occasional encounters between surface people and community members, encounters that the surface people found inexplicable and that they described in whatever framework their culture provided. We'd expect to see physical evidence that was fragmentary and difficult to interpret without specific knowledge of what to look for. We'd expect to see anomalous geological and geophysical data in the relevant region that was attributed to mundane causes because the investigators didn't have the conceptual framework to interpret it otherwise. We'd expect to see a systematic pattern of discouragement around exploration in the relevant areas, not necessarily through explicit suppression, but through the kind of institutional inertia that redirects attention away from inconvenient anomalies. and we'd expect to see the genuine evidence tangled inextricably with elaborate cultural overlays that made it extremely difficult to evaluate on its own terms. We see all of these things. That's not proof. The same pattern could be produced by a very interesting combination of geology, cultural tradition, and motivated perception applied to an ambiguous and dramatic landscape. These things happen. Humans are pattern-seeking animals in an environment full of patterns. We find what we look for, sometimes even when it isn't there. But it's also worth noting that the same skeptical argument that should make us cautious about accepting the evidence also applies to the dismissal of it. It's easy to dismiss the Mount Shasta evidence because the cultural weight of the Lemurian tradition makes the subject seem frivolous. But that dismissal is itself a motivated behavior, motivated by the desire to avoid being associated with something that looks ridiculous. That's not a good epistemic reason to dismiss evidence. The honest position is uncertainty. There is something genuinely unusual about the Mount Shasta region. What that something is, we don't know. The most radical explanation, a long-standing underground human community, would explain more of the evidence than any other single hypothesis. It would not require the evidence to be fabricated or misremembered or attributed to natural phenomena through motivated perception. It would just require that something be true that we haven't officially confirmed. That's not a comfortable place to sit. Humans don't like genuine uncertainty. We want resolution. We want the story to come out either true or false. But sometimes the honest answer is that the evidence is real, the explanation is unclear, and the investigation is incomplete. Mount Shasta is not resolved. It's open. There's a practice that some researchers have begun applying to the Mount Shasta question that's worth describing. It comes from the discipline of landscape archaeology, which looks at how human communities shape and are shaped by the physical environment they inhabit. Landscape archaeologists argue that a community that has inhabited a place for a very long time leaves marks that are different in character from the marks left by shorter-term occupation. The community doesn't just use the landscape, it incorporates it. The landscape becomes part of the community's identity and the community's memory. Features of the landscape that might look entirely natural to an outside observer become, on closer examination, organized, named, maintained. Applied to the Mount Shasta area, this approach suggests looking not at specific dramatic claims, but at the broader pattern of the landscape. Are there features that look natural but show evidence of sustained organization? Are there areas that appear in multiple independent accounts as significant but that have no obvious natural feature that would draw attention to them? Are there locations that the indigenous traditions reference repeatedly in context, suggesting they are not simply scenic but functionally significant? When researchers have applied this lens to the available data for Mount Shasta, the result is a map of the mountain's lower slopes that has an organizational character that isn't entirely explained by the geology. Certain areas appear repeatedly in accounts as significant. The same locations referenced in Wintu oral tradition appear in prospector accounts. From the 1880s appear in 20th century. Encounter reports appear in the landscape archaeologists' analysis of terrain features that seem organized rather than random. This is not proof of anything, but it's a method that takes the evidence seriously without jumping to conclusions. It says, if there is something here to find, this is where to look. And it points to specific locations with a consistency that suggests the pointing is real, even if what's being pointed at remains unclear. It's almost morning now. Not really. But in the logic of a long night of considering difficult questions, we're approaching the time when you need to decide what you carry with you and what you leave behind. The Mount Shasta mystery is not a tidy thing. It doesn't resolve into a clean answer. What it does do is reveal something about the nature of knowledge and the nature of the landscape we live in and the nature of the past that underlies the present. The Americas before European contact were not the empty, sparsely populated lands of popular imagination. They were densely inhabited, elaborately organized, deeply understood by the peoples who lived in them. That understanding was organized differently from Western scientific understanding. It was embedded in oral tradition, in ceremony, in relationships with specific places that were maintained over very long periods of time. Most of that understanding was destroyed or disrupted by what happened after 1492. What survived did so in forms that are difficult for outsiders to access and easy for outsiders to misunderstand. The Mount Shasta traditions are part of that surviving understanding. The Wintu, the Modoc, the Achumawi, the Karuk knew this mountain. They knew it for thousands of years. What they said about it was based on that long relationship. When they described underground inhabitants, they weren't being metaphorical. They were reporting what they understood to be a real feature of the world they inhabited. We don't have to accept their description uncritically, but we have to take it seriously. We have to work to understand it on its own terms before we decide it doesn't mean what it says. The geophysical anomalies are real. They've been measured. They don't have satisfying explanations. The archaeological anomalies are real. They've been documented, even if incompletely. The pattern of encounters described by independent witnesses across more than a century is real. The geographic clustering of those encounters is real. The institutional pattern of discouragement around investigation is real. What is also real is our uncertainty about what all of this means. That uncertainty is not a reason to stop looking. It's a reason to look more carefully, with better tools, with more rigorous methodology, with the intellectual honesty to report what's found without filtering it through frameworks that make it impossible to see clearly. Somewhere in the tunnels beneath the mountain, if they exist, there are people who have been living in a different relationship to the world than any of us have ever known. People who measure time differently, who understand the interior of the earth in ways that no academic discipline has yet formalized, who have watched the surface world transform around them without being transformed by it. Or there are not. Either answer is extraordinary. The first is extraordinary in obvious ways. The second is extraordinary because it means that a century and a half of consistent, independent, geographically clustered testimony has been pointing toward nothing. That the native traditions of multiple unconnected peoples have encoded a fiction about the mountain that happens to match the fictional accounts of prospectors and mystics and forest rangers and geology students. That the geophysical anomalies are all explained by mundane geology. That the archaeological anomalies are all artifacts of poor methodology. That the institutional discouragement of investigation is coincidental. That the people who felt they were turned back from underground passages were all experiencing cave-induced psychology at the same locations. That's a lot of coincidences to accept. The mountain stands 14,000 feet and more. It stands in its isolation above the surrounding landscape, drawing people to it, producing experiences in those people that the people can't explain in standard terms. It has been doing this for as long as there have been people near it. That's the thing about Mount Shasta that is most consistent across every category of evidence. The mountain does something to people who are near it. Not everyone, not all the time, but regularly, across every demographic and every cultural framework and every level of prior belief. The mountain produces experiences that the people who have them find genuinely difficult to account for. What's inside it, what's beneath it, what it's keeping, we don't know. But we should keep looking. There is one more category of account that deserves its place in this record. These are accounts from people who were not looking for anything. People who had no knowledge of the Mount Shasta tradition, no investment in the Lemurian mythology, no spiritual seeking, no academic interest in pre-Columbian civilizations. People who happened to be in the area for entirely ordinary reasons and who had an experience that they still can't explain. A truck driver who pulled over on Route 97 to sleep and who was woken by a sound that seemed to come from below the road, a sound like machinery, rhythmic, regular, not natural. He lay there for several minutes listening to it. It stopped. He drove on. He didn't tell anyone for 20 years, until he read an article about the mountain and suddenly had a context for what he'd heard. A woman who moved to Weed, a small town at the mountain's base, for a job that had nothing to do with the mountain, and who found over several years that she occasionally woke at night with a strong sense of movement beneath the house. Not earthquake movement. Slower, more deliberate. She mentioned it to neighbors and was told, matter-of-factly, that this happened to some people in Weed. It was just the mountain. She never learned more than that. A group of teenagers who went camping on the lower slopes on a summer night, and who described their tent being illuminated from below, from the ground itself, for approximately 15 minutes in the middle of the night. Not reflected light. Not a flashlight from outside. Light from the ground. When they dug at the spot the next morning, they found ordinary soil. Whatever had produced the light left no trace they could find. These accounts don't come from seekers. They come from people who are just living their lives in proximity to something that occasionally reminded them, through sensory experience, that the ordinary explanation might not be complete. The mountain has been reminding people of this for a very long time. We began with the image of the mountain standing alone, 14,179 feet above the floor of Northern California, standing apart from its range in a way that looks almost deliberate, almost placed. The peoples who knew this mountain best, who spent the most time in its presence across the longest period, consistently described it as exactly that. Not random geology. A place, a presence. Something that had intention in the way a person has intention, not the same kind of intention, but intention nonetheless. The mountain knows you're there. The mountain responds to you. The mountain has been responding to the humans near it for as long as there have been humans near it. The science of that is beginning to be articulated. Volcanic mountains in geothermally active zones do produce complex effects on the electromagnetic environment, on the acoustic environment, on the visual environment, under certain conditions. The mountain is not alive in any literal sense, but it is active in ways that produce real effects on living beings that spend time near it. Some of those effects are well understood, some are not. The mystery of what is inside the mountain, what might be beneath it, what the pattern of encounter accounts across a century and a half might be pointing toward, that mystery sits at the intersection of geology and archaeology and cultural history and the simple, irreducible fact of human experience. People have been having experiences near and on this mountain that don't fit the official description of what the mountain is. Either those experiences are real observations of a real phenomenon, or they represent something equally interesting, a sustained, cross-cultural, multi-generational shared encounter with an environment that produces consistent responses in human nervous systems through mechanisms we don't fully understand. Both of those possibilities are worth investigating seriously. Neither of them is resolved. The investigation is not complete. The tunnels, if they exist, are not mapped. The chambers, if they exist, are not documented. The community, if it exists, has not made itself known in a way that the surface world has been able to verify. But something is there. The mountain stands, and in the rock beneath it, something persists. Something old, something patient. Something that has been waiting, if waiting is the right word, for the surface world to develop the capacity and the honesty to look at it without flinching. We're not there yet, but the mountain isn't going anywhere. And neither, it seems, is whatever the mountain is keeping. If this journey through the tunnels beneath Mount Shasta kept your mind gently wandering while the night settled in around you, that's exactly what these videos are for. You can tap the like button if you'd like more stories like this. Explorations that go deep into mountains, into mysteries, into the parts of history that the official record hasn't quite figured out what to do with yet. Subscribe if you want to be here when the next one comes. I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight. Leave a comment if you feel like it. Your city, your country, just the word listening if that's all you have. There's a quiet kind of community in knowing how many different places are connected by the same story at the same moment, in the same glow of a screen in the dark. For those who want to support the channel further, the membership option is here and completely optional. These long, careful dives take time, and every bit of support helps make sure there's always another one waiting when you need it. For now, you don't need to do anything at all. Just let it settle. The mountain is still out there in the dark. 14,000 feet of volcanic rock, with whatever it holds inside it, standing alone, patient, keeping its secrets one more night. Rest well. The mysteries will still be there in the morning. Good night. Let's stay with the mountain a little longer. There's more to say. The question that keeps coming back, the one that sits beneath all the others like the mountain itself sits beneath the landscape around it, is the question of continuity. How does something persist? How does a community, a tradition, a body of knowledge, survive intact across centuries of change in the surface world above it? The surface world changes constantly. Empires rise and collapse. Languages evolve and die. Peoples are displaced and absorbed. The technologies that define one century are obsolete in the next. The frameworks through which a generation understands its world bear almost no resemblance to the frameworks of the generation 200 years before it. Change is the defining feature of surface civilization. It's rapid, it's constant, and it's often catastrophic. Underground, the conditions are different. Not in every way. Humans underground face the same fundamental challenges that humans everywhere face. They age, they die. They have children who don't automatically share their parents' values. They argue, they disagree, they develop factions. The social dynamics of a small, isolated community are not simpler than those of a large surface community. In some ways, they're more intense, because the stakes of social failure are higher when you can't simply leave. But the physical environment underground is stable in a way the surface environment isn't. The temperature in a geothermally heated cave system doesn't change with the seasons. The water supply from an underground aquifer doesn't vary with rainfall patterns on the surface. The food sources available in a geothermally active ecosystem don't migrate with the seasons. The rhythms that drive so much of the change in surface life, the cycling of seasons, the variation of climate, the availability of food that follows those cycles, these rhythms don't penetrate underground to the same degree. If you remove from human life the constant pressure to adapt to changing environmental conditions, what you get is more capacity for something else. More capacity for the refinement of existing knowledge. More capacity for the development of deep expertise in specific domains. More capacity for the maintenance of traditions across generations without the pressure of external disruption. The surface world's advantage is diversity and rapid change. The underground community's potential advantage is depth and continuity. Different strategies for the same fundamental challenge of maintaining a human civilization across time. It's worth thinking about what a civilization that prioritized depth and continuity over centuries might actually look like. It would probably look small. Small communities can maintain coherence in ways that large communities cannot. It would probably look specialized. With limited numbers, you can't afford to have multiple people doing the same things. Everyone has a role, and the role matters. It would probably look ancient. Not in the sense of primitive, but in the sense of carrying genuinely old knowledge, accumulated over very long periods without the interruption that comes from catastrophic external change. And it would probably look strange to outsiders. Deliberately strange. Strange in the way that a community that has been maintaining its isolation for a long time would look to someone from the surface world. The strangeness not of underdevelopment, but of radical difference. A different set of priorities, a different relationship to time, a different understanding of what constitutes valuable knowledge, a different relationship to the physical environment. The witnesses who describe encounters with individuals from within the mountain consistently note this quality of difference. Not inferiority, not superiority, just difference. An encounter across a cultural gap so profound that the usual tools for navigating cultural difference don't apply. You can't assume shared frames of reference. You can't assume shared timelines. You can't assume shared categories of importance. What you can do is listen carefully to what's actually being said and let it mean what it means without immediately translating it into a more familiar framework. The mountain's indigenous sacred geography deserves more attention than it's usually given in accounts of the Shasta mystery. Sacred geography is the organized understanding of a landscape in terms of spiritual significance. It's not arbitrary. It's not simple superstition. It's the product of extended, careful observation of a landscape over long periods, encoded in forms that preserve the information across generations. Sacred geography says, this place is significant in this way. This place is to be approached with this kind of care. This place connects to this kind of experience. The sacred geography of the Mount Shasta region, as preserved in the traditions of the peoples who developed that geography over millennia, is remarkably detailed. Specific locations on and around the mountain are associated with specific kinds of experience. The associations aren't vague. They're not simply, this place is holy. They're specific. This place is where certain kinds of knowledge can be accessed. This place is where contact with certain kinds of beings is possible. This place is where the boundary between the underground world and the surface world is thin. The specificity matters. General reverence for a mountain is common in many cultures. You take a dramatic, isolated volcanic peak and people will develop reverence for it. That's not unusual. What's unusual about the Shasta geography is the operational character of it. It's not just that the mountain is sacred. It's that specific locations on the mountain do specific things. It reads less like religious reverence and more like a practical map. A practical map suggests practical knowledge. Knowledge gained through experience. Knowledge about what actually happens at those locations, observed over sufficient time to be confident about. The Wintu didn't develop the idea that people come from inside the mountain by making it up. They developed it because, over the generations, people came from inside the mountain. The observation accumulated. The tradition formed around the accumulated observation. The tradition preserved the observation through the generations that followed. This is how oral tradition works when it's functioning properly. It's not mythology in the sense of narrative embellishment separated from factual observation. It's knowledge management. It's the preservation of observed fact in a form that can be transmitted without writing, using narrative as the encoding mechanism. The story is the vehicle for the information. The information is real. Reading native oral traditions with this framework changes what you see in them. Instead of looking for the mythological layer to see through to an underlying historical event, you look for the operational content. What are they actually saying happened? What practical knowledge is embedded in the narrative form? When the Wintu described the people from inside the mountain, stripped of the narrative context, the operational content is, there are people who emerge from below the surface of this mountain at specific locations. They have been observed doing this. They possess knowledge that surface people do not have. They interact selectively and purposefully. That's a description of a real phenomenon. Whether or not everything else in the tradition around it is also factually accurate. The first systematic attempt to apply modern geological survey techniques to the Mount Shasta underground question was conducted in the late 1980s by a private research group that has never been publicly identified. The account of this survey comes from a single source, a researcher who was peripherally connected to the group and who gave an account to a journalist in the early 2000s. According to this account, the group used a combination of ground-penetrating radar, magnetometry, and seismic profiling to map the subsurface structure of the mountain's lower slopes over a period of several weeks. The survey was conducted without official permission, which limited the area that could be covered and the depth that the instruments could profile effectively. What the survey produced, according to this account, was a subsurface picture significantly more complex than what the official geological record described. The ground-penetrating radar showed multiple void spaces at depths ranging from a few meters to the limit of the instrument's penetration. Some of these voids had the irregular character of natural geological features. Others showed boundaries that were more regular, more organized, than natural features typically produce. The magnetometry produced a pattern of anomalies that didn't correspond to the distribution of magnetic minerals that the surface geology would predict. The anomalies clustered in areas that also showed void spaces in the radar data. The seismic profiling was the most interesting. When small controlled explosions were used to generate seismic waves and the reflections were analyzed, the data showed reflective boundaries at depth that suggested not just void spaces, but transitions between materials with very different physical properties. The specific signature was consistent with the boundary between natural rock and a more uniform material, potentially worked stone or compacted fill. The group was unable to complete its survey before it was approached by Forest Service personnel and asked to cease operations. They complied. The data they had collected was apparently analyzed over the following months, and the analysis apparently produced conclusions significant enough that the group chose to keep them private rather than publish them. The source who described the survey didn't know the conclusions. He knew only that the data was considered too significant to release. This account is, like most of the significant accounts in the Mount Shasta record, impossible to verify from the outside. There is no documented evidence of the survey. The group conducting it is not identified. The conclusions are unknown. It exists only in the testimony of a single peripheral participant. But it's consistent with the broader pattern, technical investigation that produces anomalous results. Anomalous results that are suppressed rather than published. A record that exists only in accounts rather than in documents. If this pattern were occurring in a single case, it would be easy to dismiss as individual error or fabrication. Occurring repeatedly across different investigators, different periods, different methods, the pattern itself becomes data, not proof of any specific thing, but data about the relationship between the Mount Shasta region and the institutional systems that are supposed to produce knowledge about it. The acoustic environment of the Mount Shasta region has been studied, in limited ways, by researchers interested in the effect of volcanic landscapes on sound propagation. Volcanic terrains produce unusual acoustic conditions for several reasons. The irregular surfaces of lava formations reflect and scatter sound in complex ways. Geothermal features produce continuous broadband noise that can mask or interfere with other sound. Underground spaces, even ones with relatively small surface openings, can act as resonators that amplify or modify particular frequencies. Some researchers have proposed that the experience of being near certain geological features produces altered states of consciousness through acoustic mechanisms. Infrasound, sound at frequencies below the normal range of human hearing, is generated by a variety of natural sources including volcanic and geothermal activity. Infrasound at certain frequencies and intensities affects human physiology in documented ways, including producing feelings of unease, awe, or unusual perceptual experiences. Research by acoustic engineer Vic Tandy and others has documented that infrasound at approximately 18.9 Hz can produce vibration in the human eyeball that results in peripheral visual anomalies, fuzzy edges, apparent movement of stationary objects. Applied to the Mount Shasta situation, this framework suggests that some of the unusual experiences people report near the mountain, particularly the sense of presences, the peripheral visual phenomena, the feelings of being watched, or of being in a place where the ordinary rules don't apply, could be generated by infrasound from geothermal sources. The locations where these experiences cluster would correspond to locations where the underground acoustic environment produces the appropriate frequencies at the surface. This is a partial explanation at best. It accounts for some features of some reports. It doesn't account for the physical encounters with specific individuals. It doesn't account for the archaeological anomalies. It doesn't account for the geophysical survey data. But it's an example of the kind of mechanism that could contribute to the experience without requiring any exotic hypothesis, and it's worth including in a comprehensive account. The acoustic environment of the mountain is real. Its effects on human perception are real and documentable. Any complete account of the Mount Shasta phenomenon needs to incorporate this dimension, rather than treating the human experience reports as straightforwardly transparent windows onto physical reality. But it also needs to incorporate the reports that can't be reduced to acoustic effects, the accounts of physical encounters, the documented artifacts, the geophysical anomalies, the consistent geographic clustering of accounts across independent witnesses separated by decades. These things don't dissolve into acoustic explanation. In 2008, a researcher named Joanna Martinez, then working toward a doctorate in cultural anthropology at a California university, spent several months in the Mount Shasta region conducting interviews for a dissertation project on the persistence of non-mainstream spiritual beliefs in contemporary American communities. Her project wasn't about the tunnels. It was about the I Am activity and the other spiritual communities that had organized around the mountain over the decades. In the course of her interviews, she encountered something she hadn't expected, and that took her work in a direction she hadn't anticipated. She found, embedded within the testimonies of people who were primarily associated with the established spiritual communities, accounts of experiences that those individuals specifically separated from their spiritual beliefs. Experiences they described as distinct from their religious practice. Things that had happened to them that they were reluctant to discuss in the context of the mountain's mystical reputation, precisely because they wanted the accounts to be taken seriously, and they knew the mystical association would prevent that. What these individuals described, consistently and with evident discomfort about discussing it, was encounter. Physical encounter with individuals who appeared from the mountain and who engaged with them briefly before returning to the mountain. Not visions, not spiritual experiences. Actual encounters with physical people who seemed to come from inside the mountain and to return to it. The reluctance to discuss these accounts within the context of the spiritual tradition was significant. These were people who had organized their lives around a spiritual relationship with Mount Shasta. They believed in the mountain's spiritual significance deeply and sincerely. And yet when it came to describing their actual encounters with the underground community, they reached for a different register, a more literal, more physical, more ordinary register, because they wanted to be clear that what they were describing wasn't a spiritual experience, it was a physical one, a real person, a real conversation, a real disappearance afterward. Martinez's dissertation touched on these accounts but did not make them central to her argument, because her dissertation was about spiritual belief rather than about the physical reality of what the mountain contained. She has subsequently described the encounter accounts as among the most significant things she collected during her fieldwork, and as something she has been uncertain how to handle professionally because the accounts point toward a conclusion that her academic framework doesn't provide tools to address. She's not alone in that situation. Many researchers who have spent serious time with the Mount Shasta evidence find themselves in the same position. The tools they have are inadequate to the phenomenon they've encountered. The frameworks they've been trained in don't have categories for what they're looking at, and professional survival requires staying within the frameworks, which means filing the anomalous data away rather than letting it change the conclusion. That's the deepest problem in this field of inquiry. Not fabrication, not motivated perception, not the Lemurian overlay. The deepest problem is that the institutions that should be investigating this phenomenon are structurally unable to investigate it honestly, because honest investigation leads to conclusions that those institutions don't have the conceptual infrastructure to manage. The mountain is geologically young by the standards of the landscape it sits in. Much of the surrounding terrain is far older, shaped by processes that preceded Shasta's existence. This means the mountain was built on top of a landscape that already had structure, that already had its own geological history, its own cave systems, its own underground hydrology. When the volcanic activity that built Shasta began, it didn't obliterate the pre-existing underground structure. It built over it. The lava flows that constitute the mountain's body were laid down on top of terrain that already had its own underground features. Those pre-existing features weren't necessarily destroyed by the volcanic activity. In some cases, they would have been sealed or filled. In other cases, the volcanic material would have flowed around them, preserving void spaces beneath the lava. This means the underground structure of the region around Shasta is a palimpsest. Multiple layers of geological history, each with its own network of passages and chambers, laid over each other and partially connected by processes that occurred at the interfaces between layers. The complexity of this structure is not something that can be adequately characterized from the surface. What it means practically is that the cave systems accessible from the mountain's surface are not the only underground spaces in the region. They're the top layer. Below them are older formations that were established before the mountain existed. Below those, older still. The potential depth and extent of the underground structure is far greater than what surface investigation has addressed. If there is a community living in these underground spaces, they have potentially had access to far more extensive territory than the mountain's surface profile would suggest. The mountain is the entry point. The actual space available underground, if the geological analysis is correct, extends well beyond the mountain's footprint. This might explain the accounts of tunnel networks connecting the mountain to other significant geological features in the region. If the underground structure is a connected network rather than a set of isolated features, then movement through that network from one surface access point to another would not require traversing the surface at all. You could enter the underground near Shasta and exit at a location many miles away without appearing on the surface in between. The oral traditions of the Achumawi and other peoples of the region describe exactly this. A network of underground passages connecting multiple significant locations. The ability to travel distances underground that would be much longer on the surface. The existence of communities at multiple points in this network, not just beneath Shasta. This is a picture of a regional underground civilization rather than a single isolated community, which would change the question of how such a community sustains itself. Because a network of communities can share resources and knowledge in ways that a single isolated community cannot. It also changes the question of scale. A single community of hundreds might struggle to maintain itself over centuries. A network of communities across a region might sustain a civilization of thousands across millennia. The oldest stories are sometimes the most accurate, not in every detail, not in the literal content of every narrative element, but in the fundamental structure of what they're describing. The oldest stories associated with the mountain, preserved in the oral traditions of the peoples who lived nearest to it across the longest period, describe the mountain as a place where the earth opens, where people come out from inside, where knowledge passes between worlds. This description is simple. It doesn't require a cosmological framework to contain it. It's a description of observed phenomena. The most recent accounts, the ones from the 20th and 21st centuries, describe the same thing in different words. People coming from inside the mountain, knowledge being exchanged, a community living below. The words are different because the cultural frameworks are different. The account is the same. That continuity across cultural frameworks, across generations, across centuries, is the thing that resists explanation. Cultural traditions are conservative. They preserve things. They don't usually invent things from whole cloth and then maintain the invention perfectly stable across generations and cultural transformations. What they preserve is what they observed. What they observed was real. The mountain is real. The geological complexity beneath it is real. The long human presence near it is real. The consistency of what that presence has reported across its entire documented history is real. Whether or not the underground community is real, whether or not the tunnels are real in the way that physical tunnels are real, something about this place has produced something consistent in the human beings who have spent time near it across a very long time. That something is worth taking seriously, not because it's comfortable or convenient to do so, but because the alternative is to look at the evidence and decide that all of it means nothing, that all of it is error and fabrication and motivated perception, that there is nothing here to find. And that conclusion, the comfortable one, requires us to make assumptions about the reliability of human observation, the stability of oral tradition, and the character of institutional knowledge suppression that are harder to defend than the alternative. The alternative is simpler. Something is there. We don't know exactly what. The investigation is incomplete. We should continue it. The light that witnesses describe coming from within the mountain, from cracks in the rock face and from ground-level vents, and from openings that appear and disappear in the terrain, is one of the most persistently reported features of the Shasta encounter record. Light from below has a specific quality that witnesses consistently note. It doesn't behave like reflected light. Reflected light, even from a powerful source, diffuses as it bounces from surface to surface. The light described by witnesses near Shasta is described as coherent. It comes from a specific direction, and it maintains its character across the space it illuminates. It's not like a campfire seen through trees. It's like a window, a directed emission from a source with purpose. Bioluminescence is one natural mechanism for underground light production. The cave systems of New Zealand, for example, produce spectacular light shows through the bioluminescent larvae of a specific species of gnat. Cave fungi produce visible light in some environments. Certain mineral formations have phosphorescent properties that allow them to emit light after exposure to radiation. But the light witnesses described near Shasta doesn't match bioluminescent character. It's too directed, too bright. It doesn't have the diffuse blue-green quality of most biological light sources. The witnesses describe it as warm in color, sometimes almost golden, sometimes more neutral. If the underground environment is inhabited, artificial light sources are a necessity. And an inhabited underground environment over a long period would develop whatever light sources were available. Geothermal chemistry produces potential sources. Certain chemical reactions produce sustained light. The refinement of available natural light sources over a long period of time, building on whatever materials the environment provides, could in principle produce something that appears coherent and directional from the outside, without being modern in any electrical sense. The light is not proof of habitation. It's one more feature of the Shasta environment that doesn't have a fully satisfying conventional explanation, and that is consistent with the hypothesis of underground human presence. We've been inside this story for a long time now, long enough that the shape of it has become familiar. The structure of encounter, observation, institutional dismissal, persistence of account, geographical clustering, cultural consistency. These are the bones of the story. The flesh is different every time. Different witnesses, different periods, different cultural frames. But the bones are the same. That consistency is the most significant thing about the Mount Shasta evidence. Not any individual account, not any specific artifact or geological datum. The consistency across the entire body of evidence over the entire period of documented observation. Something about this mountain is doing something to the people who get close to it. Producing the same categories of experience in independent observers across a century and a half of documentation, generating the same geographic clustering of unusual reports from witnesses with no connection to each other, maintaining the same fundamental structure of encounter as the oral traditions that preceded the documented record by millennia. This is not what you would expect from a mountain that is simply a mountain. It is what you would expect from a mountain that is also something else, something that has been there for a very long time. Something that is careful about how it presents itself to the surface world. Something that has survived, in whatever form it takes, by being mostly invisible and mostly silent, by letting the surface world attribute what people observe to natural causes and mystical tradition, by relying on the surface world's tendency to explain away the anomalous rather than investigate it. If you are trying to maintain an underground community across a very long period of time, the strategy of strategic invisibility, of being there but not quite there, of letting the legends grow in ways that discredit serious inquiry, of appearing occasionally and briefly to specific individuals and trusting that those individuals will be unable to adequately describe what they've seen in terms that their cultural environment will take seriously, that strategy would work. It has been working for as long as the documented record extends, and probably long before that. The mountain keeps its secrets because the surface world is very good at keeping them for it. Every time a serious investigator gets close, something happens. The investigation is redirected. The data is suppressed. The investigator finds themselves in a professional position where publishing what they've found would be career-ending. The legend absorbs the account and makes it look like more legend. Whether this is active management from below, from the community itself, or simply the operation of surface world institutional dynamics, the result is the same. The secret persists. And so we return to where we began. A mountain standing alone in Northern California, 14,000 feet and more, drawing people to it across centuries for reasons they can't always articulate. People who feel something pulling them there, something they can't name, something that starts as a curiosity and ends as a conviction. The conviction that something is there, something old, something patient, something that has been in that mountain longer than anything in the official historical record can account for. Whether that conviction is true, we don't know for certain. Whether the tunnels are real in the physical, mappable, measurable sense, we haven't been able to verify. Whether the community is real, whether the encounters are real, whether the geological anomalies point toward something human and intentional, or merely toward geological complexity, we can't say definitively. What we can say is that the question hasn't been answered, the investigation hasn't been completed, the evidence hasn't been fully evaluated in a context that takes it seriously on its own terms, rather than filtering it through frameworks that make serious evaluation impossible. The mountain deserves a genuine inquiry. The witnesses deserve to be heard. The indigenous traditions deserve to be engaged with as repositories of careful, long-term observation, rather than dismissed as mythology. The geological and geophysical anomalies deserve systematic investigation rather than attribution to mundane causes without adequate evidence for that attribution. This is not a closed case. It's an open question. And open questions are the most interesting ones, because they still have the potential to change everything we think we know. The mountain stands, patient, silent, keeping whatever it keeps, waiting, perhaps, for the surface world to develop the tools and the intellectual honesty to look at it without flinching. We're not there yet, but we're closer than we were, and the question is still alive. That's enough, for now, to be going on with. There's a category of evidence that doesn't get discussed often in accounts of the Mount Shasta mystery, and that's the evidence from people who tried to leave it alone. There are researchers, journalists, and documentary filmmakers who began projects focused on the mountain's underground traditions and who, at some point in the process, chose to abandon those projects without completing them, not because they ran out of funding, though that happened too, not because the subject proved uninteresting, quite the opposite, but because they encountered something in the course of their research that gave them pause in a way they found difficult to articulate. One documentary filmmaker who had been working on a project about sacred sites in the American West spent 3 weeks in the Shasta region in the mid-1990s. He had planned to include Shasta as one stop in a broader survey. He ended up spending all 3 weeks there and ultimately chose not to include the Shasta material in his finished film. In an interview given years later, he described his decision in terms that sound evasive, but that he was clearly trying to make precise. He said he felt that including the material would be a kind of violation, not of a law or an agreement, of something he couldn't name. He said it felt like publishing someone's private correspondence without permission. The information was real. It was his to use if he chose. But using it felt wrong in a way he couldn't justify rationally and couldn't ignore emotionally. A journalist who spent several months researching the Shasta accounts for a long-form magazine piece described something similar. She had gathered substantial material. She had conducted interviews, reviewed archival records, consulted with geologists and anthropologists. The piece was essentially written, and then she didn't publish it. She told colleagues at the time that she needed more time with the material. She never returned to it. Years later, she described the decision as one she still didn't fully understand. She knew the piece was good. She knew the material was significant. Something had stopped her that she couldn't name. These accounts are anecdotal. They don't prove anything about what's beneath the mountain, but they add a texture to the record that's worth noting. The people who got closest to the material, who spent the most time with it, who were most positioned to bring it to wide attention, often chose not to. Whatever they found in their research, it produced in them not the desire to share it as widely as possible, which is the normal motivation for journalists and filmmakers, but something closer to restraint, a sense that the sharing would be inappropriate in a way that preceded rational justification. That's a strange outcome for people who went in looking to expose a story. The water that comes down from Mount Shasta feeds a significant portion of Northern California's surface hydrology. The mountain's snowpack is one of the primary sources of water for the Sacramento River and its tributaries. This is well documented and not mysterious. What's less discussed is the underground hydrology. The mountain's snowmelt doesn't all run off the surface. A significant portion percolates into the volcanic rock, entering a subsurface hydrological system that is complex and incompletely mapped. This water doesn't all emerge quickly. Volcanic rock aquifer systems can hold water for decades or centuries before it re-emerges at springs, seeps, or outflows far from where it entered. The springs around the base of Shasta are thus connected to precipitation that fell on the mountain years or decades ago. The travel time through the underground system is long enough that the water acquires a specific mineral signature from the rock it passes through. Hydrologists can trace this signature and use it to understand something about the paths the water has taken underground. What the hydrology of the Shasta area suggests is that the underground flow paths are extensive. Water that enters the mountain's upper slopes can re-emerge at locations miles away from the mountain's visible footprint. The underground hydrological system extends the mountain's influence into the surrounding landscape in ways that aren't obvious from the surface. An underground community with knowledge of this hydrological system would have access to water resources distributed across a much wider area than just the mountain itself. They would effectively have a water network, underground channels moving fresh water through the geological structure in ways that could be accessed at multiple points. The springs at the base of the mountain that witnesses frequently associate with encounter reports are precisely the kinds of locations where an underground hydrological system would be most accessible from below. This isn't proof of anything, but it's another piece of the physical picture that fits coherently with the hypothesis of extended underground habitation. The resources are there, the water is there, the geological structure to support extended underground presence is there. The question remains whether someone is using those resources, but the resources themselves are not in dispute. One aspect of the Mount Shasta mystery that rarely receives adequate attention is its relationship to the broader pattern of anomalous, pre-Columbian North American archaeology. The standard account of pre-Columbian North America describes a continent inhabited by hunter-gatherer peoples in the north, with more complex agricultural civilizations developing in the south, particularly in Mesoamerica. The North American interior and the Pacific coast are described as sparsely populated with relatively simple social structures. This account is wrong in several ways that archaeology has been slowly correcting over the past few decades. The scale of pre-Columbian North American civilization was far larger than previously acknowledged. The city of Cahokia, near present-day St. Louis, was larger than contemporary London at its peak. The agricultural systems of the eastern woodlands were more extensive and sophisticated than early European observers reported. The trade networks connecting different regions of the continent were more complex and long-range than textbooks have generally acknowledged. These corrections haven't fully changed the popular picture, but they suggest that the standard account has systematically underestimated the complexity of pre-Columbian North America and that further corrections may still be needed. The Mount Shasta area sits at the intersection of several significant pre-Columbian cultural zones. The cultures of the California coast, the cultures of the Great Basin interior, the cultures of the Pacific Northwest, and the cultures of the Desert Southwest all had ranges that extended into or near this region. The mountain itself would have been known to peoples across an enormous geographic area. As a landmark of extraordinary visibility, it served as a reference point in the mental geographies of peoples across the entire far western portion of the continent. If there was something significant about the mountain, if it was a site of unusual importance or unusual activity, it would have been known about, in some form, by peoples across a vast area. The consistency of unusual accounts across multiple distinct cultural traditions might not just reflect independent observation of the same local phenomenon. It might reflect the transmission of information about the mountain through those long-range trade and communication networks. Peoples across the continent knowing about the mountain, knowing about what it contained, in the way that significant sites were known about through the networks that connected pre-Columbian North America. The tunnels beneath Mount Shasta, if they are real, are not an isolated local curiosity. They are part of a continental story about the depth and complexity of what existed in North America before European contact disrupted it. A story we are still only beginning to learn to read.